Our 20th country in Africa is Equatorial Guinea, a little rectangle and some islands, but only some of those islands, not all. Let's find out why. Geography. Despite the name, the equator does not pass through Equatorial Guinea, but the country does straddle it, and it is located along the Gulf of Guinea. Equatorial Guinea comprises two regions, the two islands of Bioko and Annobon, and the mainland called Rio Muni. Rio Muni is named after the Muni estuary in the southwest, but the main river is the Mbini or Benito River. Rising in the East Plateau, it flows west into a valley north of the Crystal Mountains before draining the coastal plain into the Atlantic. The islands, meanwhile, were formed by volcanic hotspots, like the Comoros or Réunion, creating a chain called the Cameroon Line. Annobon is the smallest, and her volcano is extinct. Meanwhile, Bioko, the largest island, has three volcanoes, which are probably still active. It isn't clear when they last erupted, nor when they will erupt again. Equatorial Guinea's equatorial position gives it a tropical wet climate, technically tropical monsoon with a very wet season and a season that's not as wet. Interestingly, due to the way air and ocean currents flow around the Gulf, Bioko's dry season falls December to February, while on the mainland it's June to August. Equatorial Guinea is covered in rainforest, most of it still intact. Familiar African beasts live on the mainland, while endemic species of plants and animals live on the islands. Pygmies. Tens of thousands of years ago, as ancient Homo sapiens spread from somewhere in Southeast Africa, those who remained in the jungle changed, becoming diminutive, adapting to the conditions of the dense forest. These are the Pygmies, the indigenous folk of Central Africa. During the last glacial maximum, some 20,000 years ago, with massive amounts of water frozen in the expansive ice sheets, Bioko was connected to the mainland. As a result, Bioko was inhabited as history began, while Annobon remained empty, virgin land. Bantu. As this series unfolds, I learn along with you all, and sometimes I learn things after the fact. I base the peopling of Africa on extensive studies of the peoples and languages, but a lot of it has to be inferred in the absence of historical records. There's a definite bias in Eurasia's evolution compared to Africa, for a number of reasons, so I have to play detective. I mention this because in Gabon's episode I said the Bantu originated somewhere in southwestern Cameroon, and I'm still sticking with this. I also said they migrated southwards to the Ogowe River, probably by the 2nd millennium BC, replacing and displacing the native Pygmies. So far, so good. But when they break up, it's hard to say exactly when, as we have no records of Proto-Congolese or Shona or Zulu. Our records go back at best a few hundred years. But for convenience, I've set the Great Divergence in the mid-1st millennium AD. Now, the Plateau Bantu occupy the plateaus of Gabon, but their extent might have been far further north than I originally realized, as far as the Ntem River. North of them are the northwestern Bantu, descendants of the original Bantu who remained in the homeland. Soon, the northern plateau folk become a distinct Kele-Tsogo branch, and the northwesterners across the Ntem, the Beti. Sometime in the early Middle Ages, another clade of northwestern Bantu, the Sawa Bantu, crossed the 20 miles, 32 kilometers, from the coast of Cameroon to Bioko, colonizing the local Pygmies, creating the Bubi people. By the turn of the millennium, the northern Kele-Tsogo split off as the Kele group, and soon the Beti expand southwards to meet them. Exactly what drives this is unknown, but the Beti managed to overrun most of the Kele, leaving survivors along the coast, forming the Lenge. The conquering Beti are known thereafter as the Fang, the dominant culture in the region. Again, dates aren't certain, but by the beginning of the early modern period, we'll say 1450, merchant folk from Cameroon, the Sawa Bantu, colonized the coast, pushing the Lenge between them and the Fang. The Sawa Bantu control trade between Gabon and Nigeria and become several groups. The Yassa migrants of the north become the Kombe, the central Malimba into the Batanga, while the southern Sawa Bantu become the Benga, and apparently another northwestern people, the Ungumba, members of the Bomwali, wander far from home and settle the coastal plain as the Quasio. For simplicity, the Spanish later divided the mainland people into the Fang and the Playeros, the beach folk. Fernal Dupont. We've put all the native people of Equatorial Guinea in place, so next come our favorite pioneers of exploration, The Portuguese. Before Dias and da Gama's more famous expeditions, Fernão Po discovered the island of Bioko in 1472. He called it Formosa Flora, the beautiful flower, but his own name stuck instead. Maybe also he, I wasn't able to find out for sure, discovered Annobon in 1473, named Annobon, good year, after its discovery on New Year's Day. They, along with the neighboring islands of São Tomé and Príncipe, which we'll get to next time, offered good spots for bases along the African coast, and the Portuguese began settling them. 1493, São Tomé, presumably along with Annobon, was claimed, followed by Fernão de Po the next year. They both became captaincies, granted to wealthy men to shoulder the costs of developing them, but in 1522 the Portuguese crown annexed them outright as colonies. Besides as stopovers to and from the African mainland, the Portuguese used these islands to grow sugar, and those new sugar plantations required labor, prompting the Portuguese to import slaves from the Congolese kingdoms to the south. It is like this that Annobon was settled, while slaves on Fernão de Po generally assimilated amongst the Bubi. Meanwhile, Portuguese didn't bother much with the mainland, trading with the Sao Bantu and Fang from time to time. As the 16th and 17th centuries wore on, places like Brazil and the Caribbean outpaced the Guinea Islands in sugar production, and labor disputes in the form of slave rebellions caused a decline. At least they could fall back on ports for trade, especially for the export of slaves to Brazil and the Caribbean. 1752, the Portuguese amalgamated the Cameroon line as their colony of São Tomé, Príncipe, and Fernando Po. Now, if you've been watching the series for a while, you'll remember in 1494, Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas with Spain, dividing the non-Christian world between themselves. Portugal got Africa and Asia, Spain the Americas and Pacific. This will come up again, but in 1750, the two decided to abandon the arrangement. Their spheres were pretty well established by then, and both were having trouble enforcing their monopolies against the newer colonial powers of England, France, and the Netherlands. Spain and Portugal had been bumping elbows in South America, so, in 1778, the two signed the Treaty of El Pardo, adjusting the borders in South America, but also granting to Spain the islands of Fernão de Po and Annobon, now Fernando Po and Annobon. Spain also got exclusive trading rights to the African coast between the Niger and Ogowe rivers. It seems kind of random to get two African islands for affairs in America, but now Spain had a direct source for people from the rich slave markets of Biafra, sent directly from Fernando Po across the Atlantic to Buenos Aires. But why Annobon, the island on the other side of the archipelago? I guess Spain wanted an even split, and Portugal was only willing to part with that one. The new colony of Fernando Po and dependencies was placed under the administration of the distant viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, the future Argentina, Uruguay, Bolivia, and Paraguay, as Buenos Aires was Spain's only colonial port on the South Atlantic. Spain didn't get much time to enjoy her new colony before Napoleon burst onto the scene, putting his brother on the throne in 1808. This kicked off wars of independence in Spanish America. By 1826, Spain had forever lost its colonies on the American mainland, left with a smattering of islands across the world, including Fernando Po. By this time, Britain had convinced the European powers to end the Atlantic slave trade. With the slave money all dried up, Spain thought they'd get something by leasing Fernando Po to the British, who built Port Clarence as their base in the Gulf of Guinea. The British were successful in their slave busting, as over 2,000 freed slaves and freedmen from Sierra Leone colonized Fernando Po, creating an English-speaking and Protestant Fernandinos people, later joined by Spanish-speaking Catholic whites, blacks, and mixed. Together, this new race constituted the ruling elite of the island. In 1843, Spain reasserted herself, gradually shifting the British back to Sierra Leone, a process that was finished by 1855, and Port Clarence was renamed Santa Isabel, in honor of then-Queen Isabel II. The Fernandinos had begun cultivating cacao, chocolate, and the Spanish wanted in on that. The demand for labor was a chronic problem of Fernando Po, and the native Bubi were pressed as forced labor, not slaves, mind you, to work the plantations, adversely affecting the population. Also, there was a renewed interest in Africa. Scramble for Africa. Already in 1843, the Spanish had declared a protectorate over the three islands at the mouth of the Muni River, Corisco Elobe Grande, and Elobe Chico, combining them with Anabon as the protectorate of Elobe, Anabon, and Corisco. In the early modern period, America had been a bright new frontier to explore, expand, exploit, and develop. And the five big boys, Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands, did just that, along with some others. The independence of the United States, Haiti, Spanish America, and Brazil meant the vast majority of the New World had become their own nations with their own destinies. But by the later 19th century, those imperialist energies turned towards the wide lands of Asia and Africa, in a period called the New Imperialism. For Spain, robbed of its glorious possessions of Mexico and Peru, this train of thought probably resonated with her leaders. Alongside Henry Morton Stanley and Pierre de Brazza, Spain had her own explorer-adventurer, Manuel Iradier. In 1874, he trekked up the Muni River, documenting the land and its people for Spain. At the 1885 Berlin Conference, though past her imperial prime, Spain had gathered enough treaties with local chieftains to declare their protectorate of Rio Muni, using their old commercial rights between the Niger and Ogowe as the borders, extending eastwards to the Ubangi River. Unfortunately, squeezed between the bigger industrial powers of Britain, France, and Germany, Spain couldn't consolidate over the entire area. Already in 1885, Spain abandoned their claims north of the Intem River, also called the Campo, up to about the 2nd degree 20 minutes north latitude in favor of German Cameroon. France had done their part, annexing Gabon and the west bank of the Congo. So, in 1886, Spain relaxed their claims to north of the 1st degree north latitude. Access to the Ubangi and thence the Congo was attractive, but 'twas not meant to be. France and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris in 1900, deciding their borders not only in Guinea, but also the Western Sahara. In Guinea, though, Spanish claims east were cut off at 11 degrees 20 minutes east longitude, and the southern boundary at the 1st degree north latitude and Utamboni River was affirmed. This probably eased the minds of the Spanish who, after the Spanish-American War, were left with only their colonies in Africa. Spanish Guinea. In 1904, these Spanish territories on the Gulf of Guinea were officially designated as the Spanish territories on the Gulf of Guinea, Territorios Españoles del Golfo de Guinea. Spain sat out the chaos and destruction of the First World War, and their colonies focused on chocolate and coffee, and logging on the mainland. The fierce Fang people continued to give the Spanish authorities trouble into the 1920s. In 1926, Fernando Po, Elobe, Anabon, and Corisco, and Rio Muni were merged into the colony of Guinea. The 1936 Spanish Civil War saw Fernando Po side with the nationalists, who soon conquered Rio Muni. Afterwards, Spain sat out the Second World War, escaping the devastation over Europe. Spain was therefore under no inclinations to abandon what little empire she had left. Taking a leaf out of neighboring Portugal's book, Salazar's Estado Novo, Francisco Franco sought to bring the Spanish colonies into the mother country. Spanish Guinea became the province of the Gulf of Guinea in 1956, raised to a region in 1959 of the two provinces of Fernando Po, including Anabon, and Rio Muni. Tired of being treated as a conquered people, the majority of Spanish Guinea's people drifted towards the current of African nationalism and aspirations of independence. Spain tried to defuse this with limited autonomy in 1963, renaming the region to Equatorial Guinea to distinguish it from the newly independent Republic of Guinea. But the writing on the wall was clear. Decolonization was coming, one way or another. Francisco Macias Nguema of the popular idea of Equatorial Guinea won the 1968 election as president, overseeing independence October 12th as La República de Guinea Equatorial, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. Republic of Equatorial Guinea. At independence, Equatorial Guinea was a wealthy country, though much in the hands of the Fernandinos. President Nguema was Fang, and began steadily filling his government with family and other Fang. Soon he demanded all Spaniards leave the country, and a combination of paranoia and drugs began his descent into madness, suspecting anyone who wasn't Fang of sedition. 1973, he created a one-party regime, and executions of dissidents ramped up. He began militarizing his country, obsessed that at any day the Spanish would invade again. In his quest to purge non-African elements from his country, Nguema outlawed Western clothes, food, even names. Santa Isabel became Malabo, while Fernando Po was renamed after him. He closed schools, churches, hospitals. The economy collapsed as his militia thugs ransacked farms, businesses, homes. He even destroyed boats to prevent people from leaving. Because in all, over 50% of the population, some 100,000 people, either fled or were killed. This paranoid lunatic finally stepped too far when he began bumping off his own family members. His nephew, Teodoro Obiang, head of the military, led a coup against Ngema in 1979. Ngema fled, but was tracked down in the jungle, captured, and executed. Obiang, though, merely became a less vicious dictator compared to his uncle, winning the presidency in 1982 as the only candidate. Ngema Island was again renamed Bioko after Obiang's vice president. 1992, opposition parties were legalized, though Obiang Ngema kept winning election after election. Large oil reserves were found in 1996, in line with other large deposits in the Gulf. Of course, energy firms have concluded deals to exploit this resource, cutting Obiang a check for the privilege. 1998, Equatorial Guinea joined the Economic and Monetary Community of Central Africa, using the Central African franc to help stabilize all that oil money. To facilitate this, Equatorial Guinea adopted French as an official language. The rest of Annobonese, with closer cultural ties to neighboring Sao Tome and Principe, always have secession, either for independence or to join the other two islands, at the back of their minds. In 2010, to calm them down, Equatorial Guinea made Portuguese an official language too. Equatorial Guinea is wealthy, but that wealth is highly skewed towards the ruling dynasty, with two-thirds of the population living in poverty. Obiang Ngema has been in power for nearly 50 years, making him the longest-reigning non-royal in the world. Over that time, his regime has been accused of corruption, election fraud, embezzlement, infringement of civil liberties, torturing, extrajudicial killings, one of the worst human rights records around. Fang are 80% of the population, and government is biased towards them, probably motivating the ongoing project of moving the capital to the Ciudad de la Paz, the city of peace on the mainland. King Obiang rules by his whim, for now enabled by the oil revenues, among the largest in Africa, but there are concerns the oil could run out by 2035, and the other sectors of the economy have been neglected. In the meantime, with Obiang in his 80s, court intrigues amongst his family may soon play out. Still, Equatorial Guinea enjoys large expanses of untamed wilderness, an untapped resource for tourism. And because of this wilderness, no one ever properly surveyed the borders, allowing Equatorial Guinea to found the town of Bebeyin in what is technically Gabonese territory. Gabon did the same with Meduno in Equatorial Guinea. Wow, that was a lot for such a small country, huh? We should round off the Cameroon line next time by going to Sao Tome and Principe. See you there.